Thanks for sticking with us this afternoon. Hopefully, I'll be able to get you excited about the future of FAST in Europe to set you up for the remaining talks today. So, I'm Marcus from O&O, Oliver Ohlbaum. We're specialist advisors to the media, entertainment, and sports sectors, if you haven't heard of us before. We work extensively in TV and streaming across the value chain, so producers, distributors, to broadcasters and platforms. Whenever we talk about FAST, I like to put a bit of context around it. So as Simon was saying, the US really dominates revenues at the moment, but just comparing that to other more mature media markets across US and Europe. So traditional TV advertising, the US market is twice the size as Europe. Online video, in total, about 3 times larger. When we're talking about FAST, it's a 5 to 15 times. There's a massive gap. We'll talk through why that is. Some of the differences are implicit in the market characteristics and will be difficult to overcome. But some of them are challenges which can be faced, and we expect this gap to close over time. And there's a significant growth opportunity there for people to get it right. So what are those structural differences causing the gap? So first of all, the strength of the existing free-to-air product in Europe. So it's kind of well recognized that the strength of the PSBs, their wider portfolio, the breadth of the multi-channels in Europe is quite a compelling free-to-air product already compared to the US. Traditionally cable-based, and the over-the-air product is narrower. But what often gets unsaid is expectations and how video-on-demand viewing has been driven over time. So in Europe, it's been led in the free space by broadcaster video-on-demand services, which started out as catch-up services. And really, the expectations and habits has been developed as on-demand viewing in Europe. Whereas in the US networks have this kind of combined double focus. They have their SVOD brands, which are on-demand, and they have their separate AVOD brands. And a key distinctive component of those AVOD brands is FAST, and that has built up the audience for kind of fast ad-funded live streaming in the US, which hasn't quite happened to the same extent in Europe yet. Secondly, the ad loads in Europe compared to the US. So on the bottom, there's a very high ad load on US TV networks, anywhere from 12 to 15 minutes in peak. That is quite high compared to where FAST was. It started out at around 5 minutes of advertising per hour in the US to bring the audiences to the platform. And it's still quite far below the kind of traditional linear networks. That's attractive to audiences, and they can see the difference and transition over. Whereas in kind of the major European markets, there's tighter regulation, especially around peak time. And that difference in kind of the ad load from traditional TV to AVOD and FAST is less pronounced, which means less attractive to consumers, and they're less likely to come across. And then the third big difference is the content offering on the FAST platforms themselves. So 3 areas here: the original content on the US FAST platforms, so the likes of Roku, Freevee, Tubi investing in original content, which is largely targeting the US market, and sometimes they only take US rights on it. 2, the premium secondary rights. So you have premium titles like Westworld coming onto FAST services earlier in their cycle as well. Part of the reason for that is the vertical integration within FAST in the US. So the studios bring their own content onto their own services to kind of drive eyeballs and increase the user base of their own services. And then third, and perhaps most significantly, is news. So news channels represent anywhere from kind of 40 to 50% of FAST viewing in the US, depending on your definition, whereas it's only about 10% in Europe. That gap is probably not going to be possible to bridge in the short term. There are news providers working on it. But in the US, there is a big appetite for rolling news coverage, which doesn't exist to the same extent in Europe, where kind of consumption of news is more based around bulletins at specific time slots. So news in itself is a massive market in the US, but it should probably be treated as kind of a distinct component of the FAST market with its own dynamics and possibilities, especially for Europe. Okay, and then quickly over some other differences. So, of course, the range of territories in Europe and the different languages and content preferences creates huge difficulties. And it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are different terms of trade around content rights in the different territories, which affects what can be exploited. Pay TV churn rates are different, and the accessible market of churners, which are now looking for free-to-air alternatives, again, varies by market, and the size of online video ad markets too. So those are the downbeat slides, but getting them out of the way, there are positives and ways to overcome those challenges. So the opportunities for FAST in Europe, and really we think of these across 3 areas. So first of all, content. How can we put more appealing content onto FAST platforms to bring in the audiences? And when does it make sense, and in what to invest to do that? And secondly, on distribution, how can we increase the prominence and availability of FAST services and FAST channels in Europe? And then finally, ad sales. How can we monetize the consumption that's happening there more effectively? So first of all, on content, one of the key questions is kind of rights windowing for FAST. A lot of the time what's been happening in Europe at the moment is the content that's on there is largely archive rights, kind of very, very late window. It's content that is primarily there because otherwise it wouldn't be monetized. And it's a great incremental revenue stream for producers and channel owners. But in order to increase that user base for FAST and kind of transition audiences onto live channels delivered via IP, there needs to be investment into the content, both stuff that's locally appealing, but also bringing content earlier into its cycle onto the platform. Where that investment comes from, whether it's from the services acquiring content to grow their position in the marketplace, or channel owners trying to kind of build their brands in the space to compete better amongst the kind of massive 200 plus portfolio of FAST channels that are out there, remains to be seen. But it is a strategic question that needs to be resolved, and it may be worth sacrificing some short-term value to grow your long-term share of overall viewing into the future. Secondly, how that content is presented in terms of channels. So at the moment, a lot of viewing in FAST goes to single IP channels. That has worked well in the US, and it's quite a clear consumer proposition. People know what they're getting from each individual channel. And it works well in the US, where they're used to the syndication of long-running shows. However, over time, we may need to see a movement away from that towards more brand or genre-led channels. So single IP channels do represent a problem in terms of the exhausting through content. For instance, you can have a Deal or No Deal channel. Once the Deal or No Deal fans have gorged themselves on as much Deal or No Deal content that they can use, that channel becomes difficult to kind of keep pushing going forward. And especially in Europe, where audiences are used to kind of mixed genre scheduling on linear TV, the development of kind of more brand-led mixed genre FAST channels in the future and their promotion up FAST guides will be integral. And then also AI-driven curation. So AI is a bit of a dirty word in media, but it has been used kind of a lot over the past few years for the distribution of content online. We expect that to continue. And as these tools improve, it will make the distribution of content and the targeting of specific territories with their own needs more viable. So onto distribution. The FAST platform landscape is quite fragmented in Europe at the moment. So in the US, the big US services mainly sit on the right-hand side of that in kind of device and CTVWS providers, plus the global studios and tech players. In Europe, we also have people on the left of this diagram. So FAST channels are appearing on pay TV platforms. They're also appearing on local BVOD services. And this leads to quite a kind of confusing landscape for consumers. Everything's available everywhere. It's great for accessibility. But over time, people need to decide which partnerships to prioritize. And that will largely be defined by aggregation, as we've spoken about earlier today, and where consumers are making their decisions about content. So we like to think that kind of consumer journeys and content choices largely happen in three key spaces: EPGs, tile-based app menus, and aggregated libraries, where multiple VOD libraries can be searched within a single interface. Most of that currently happens in EPGs and app menus at the moment, and fast channels are making headroom in both of those. But there is friction. So, for instance, in EPGs, kind of the load times compared to linear channels isn't a great consumer experience. That will help over time, but the friction is a massive issue for fast, which is primarily serves as a lean-back viewing experience. And the more clicks, the more friction kind of affects the uptake. But as aggregation happens, we expect to kind of move down these three towards more app menus and aggregated libraries, and that affects what partnerships fast platforms, fast channel owners should be prioritizing going forward. More likely to be free-to-air service partnerships. So at the moment on tile-based app menus, fast services may struggle or to get prominence compared to the multitude of kind of SVOD brands, BVOD brands in the market, and it may make sense to have some partnerships there to have carriage. Whereas on aggregated services, partnerships with the owners of the aggregation, the platforms, the OS providers, will be key. And then on to ad sales. So this is actually where most progress, we're further along the line in Europe than the other two. A lot of the big channel owners already doing ad sales partnerships with big sales houses and achieving CPTs 2-3 times greater than is achievable through open programmatic sales. Any major player in Europe who isn't currently thinking or having partnerships with ad sales ought to be thinking about it. But then there's wider partnerships as well with data providers and with industry bodies to ensure quality and trust. So the likes of ThinkBox in the UK and Barb, we've seen a lot of kind of the SVOD companies and video on demand services start to integrate to access wider ad budgets. Okay, and then just to close on 2 slides, what markets should we be looking at over the next couple of years, which show signs of promise? So some markets are ripe for disruption, where pay TV is under pressure. For instance, in Germany, where cable TV contracts are slowly being cable TV contracts are slowly being phased out. There will potentially be a new audience looking for new free services. That could be right for fast to target. And then also where the free-to-air market is potentially smaller, such as Belgium, where there's less competing offering, and fast can really kind of take a share there. But as we were saying before, no single approach fits all. Other markets have challenges to navigate, so large economies, but with relatively low digital spend. There is consumption there for the taking for fast, but the ad sales partnerships probably represent even bigger priority there to access ad budgets. And then smaller markets seeing strong digital ad growth. For instance, the Baltics, they have great potential. The free-to-air broadcasters with already a strong position should be looking to kind of bolster their position in the online space through fast to kind of exploit that growing market. And then finally, just to end on some key considerations for the next phase of fast in Europe. So just to highlight really, I don't have time to speak through all of them, but the content at the top is kind of critical. We've seen secondary rights can be very popular when utilised correctly. For instance, Suits on Netflix. Over the past few years, rights owners have traditionally taken an approach of selling everything to everywhere to maximise sales. The tide on that is slowly turning, and we're seeing the value of kind of carving out exclusive windows and the kind of value in selective positioning of content, for instance, with Suits. We expect that to continue, and carving out an exclusive fast window or an earlier window for fast could help its positioning and help services. And then another one quickly, the impact of PSB prominence has been spoken about before, but that could massively impact what free-to-air services dominate in that aggregated landscape and where fast channels need to sit in order to maximise their chance of securing audiences. That's all from me today. Thanks for listening, and if you have any questions, do reach out.